Just briefly, this was intended to be a reaction video to a recent video of Dr. K. However, Dr. K has certain rules in place that don't really allow for reaction content, at least according to what I read on YouTube when I uploaded the video. So I cannot do that, which is why the content of my video will remain the same, but I strongly encourage you to go check out his video first, which I will link in the description. And that's the reason why my video says the things it says. Do check out his video first. Otherwise, it won't make a lot of sense. I fear I might be echoing the words of the almighty Dr. K, to whom I'm going to be reacting in a short bit. But yeah, generally speaking, in case you haven't noticed, I'm not a fan of pure reaction videos. But he made a video that I wanted to talk about, at least in part, because he responded to some comedian called Eliza Schlesinger that you will hear in short order. And I think he's kind of got it wrong, although he does make some valid points. Now, for the record, he's made similar observations, which he concedes in this video. I'm not going to cover everything. It's a 16-minute video. That the Lord of all black pills, the one and only rehab room, had covered. I want to give my own take on this because I think it's a misunderstanding of what's going on across the board, and I want to add my own 2 cents. So first, let's have a listen to what the so-called comedian has to say. She is a woman comedian, so you can see what's going on there, as well as some of what Dr. K has to say. It's a bit, but we're not going to cover everything. Okay. So fundamentally, he is not entirely wrong, which is to say, there are all sorts of conditions and states of being in this current society that we accept as worthy of being treated and or improved upon, or in the best case scenario, if they're overt problems, solved. He brought up the excellent example of cystic fibrosis, which is a almost purely genetic disorder, disease. And if you have the gene, I believe it's monogenetic, and you have the particular condition, without modern technological intervention, it's basically GG. That's it. It's over. And yet we do intervene on the behalf of patients with cystic fibrosis. And there are, of course, a host of other illnesses and what have you. An even simpler example of this would be people who need glasses, or people who are nearsighted or farsighted. They get glasses, they might get surgery, say laser surgery, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a whole host of conditions and states of being that we deem society-wide as worthy of being improved upon, and it doesn't really matter what it is. Now, on top of that, he mentioned some other examples. You have people with their poor decision-making. He gave the example of this guy who got drunk at the party and jumped off the roof. That is probably a Darwin Award, no pun intended there whatsoever. As well as women who, quote unquote, make poor relationship choices, right? And then they end up in, quote unquote, abusive relationships and so on and so forth. And so we typically have sympathy for at least a lot of these cases. And for some reason, when it comes to Inkwells, there doesn't seem to be much sympathy. And the claim made by Dr. K, as well as this woman, is that this is natural selection. Now, like I said, Lord Rehab Room of the Black Pill went into some considerable detail on this. I have my own take. There's some overlap of what he has to say, but it's also a bit different because natural selection is only part of the equation. The other part of the equation, the ever important part of the equation, is sexual selection. Now, frankly speaking, at least in a natural environment, there's a lot of overlap between natural selection and sexual selection. The difference being natural selection gauges, in the strictest sense of the definition of the term, how well adapted you are to your environment in order that you can survive, purely in terms of survival and what have you. The aftermath of that is typically what we call sexual selection. You survive the environment in one form or shape or another, and then it's up to, at least in mammalian species, typically not all, but most, the female then to make a decision of selection as to whether or not the male is worthy of reproducing and so on and so forth. And oftentimes it is true that the criteria that lend themselves to the survival within the naturally selected environment lend themselves additionally quite well to the criteria that allow such males to be sexually selected by females. So there is overlap, but there is a distinction. I would argue in this particular scenario that we currently find ourselves in mid-late-ish 2025 of the year of Zeus, that the natural selection criteria are still there to varying degrees, but by no means as important as they used to be, right? As Dr. K himself said, someone with cystic fibrosis back in the day was a goner. That was it. Somebody who was nearsighted, say on the savanna of Africa, could have had some serious issues because he probably wouldn't have been a great hunter. And you can just name and enumerate all kinds of illnesses and conditions and what have you, as well as just generally speaking, poor decision making. Poor decision making in an ancestral environment often led to your termination, if not other outcomes that were also quite unpleasant and then later led to your termination. So what's different now? Well, the difference is most people are not struggling to survive in a quote unquote natural environment. Even Inkwells, right, are generally surviving okay. They generally have enough. They have their video games, they have their shelter, they have the things they need to survive, right? And so what comes after that is a question of sexual selection, of sexual differentiation between them and other males. Now, of course, this female comedian, who was not funny in the slightest, surprise, surprise, goes in deep on Inkwells and suggests that they're all basically Elliot Rodgers. Now, Elliot Rodgers needs no introduction. You know who he was. He was violent. There are a few others. These are highly anomalous individuals. It doesn't even need to be pointed out because it's so blatantly obvious. But even if you take a kind of normie researcher like William Costello, who has made it his task in the current year of Zeus to study Inkwells in depth, he will acknowledge that the vast majority of them are peaceful and do not engage in such activities. Of course, the female comedian is trying to get a laugh out of the crowd, and who knows how sincere it is, it all sounds rather artificial. But yes, we're talking about sexual selection. And in terms of sexual selection, Inkwells usually do fall by the wayside. They typically fall way by the wayside in terms of looks. They also frequently have, at least according to William Costello, whom I mentioned, serious mental health issues and so on and so forth. There are a bunch of these things that are operative. I think above all looks, although people dismiss that for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, because looks are super important, as we all know. There are a bunch of these issues operative, right? And this prevents Inkwells from being successful, hence why they are Inkwells in the first place. Here's the problem, and here's the big difference. Now that we've established that this is primarily about sexual selection and not about natural selection, here's the difference between cystic fibrosis and nearsightedness and making poor decisions as a woman in the context of a relationship and not studying enough for your examinations so you flunk out of university. All these decisions, right? Your typical human ape is only vaguely aware of the instincts that drive him or her towards certain behaviors and outcomes. And so it's only when things become incredibly overt that they actually know that it's about, say, reproduction, right? And in the case of cystic fibrosis, for most people to argue that our decision to help people with cystic fibrosis, i.e. help them overcome the perils of natural selection, such that they themselves might reproduce, which you could argue is dysgenic, by the way, they will only tentatively, and perhaps not at all, make a link between that and the things I'm talking about. They don't see saving someone from cystic fibrosis as in any way, shape, or form related to reproduction. They just don't do it because humans, all of us, we're just a bunch of dumb animals, we're a bunch of dumb apes. We don't make these connections. They don't see, for example, nearsightedness as something, at least in the modern environment, that could really be impactful. When it generally isn't, because you can get glasses for laser surgery. That's true. But they certainly don't see decisions that women make above all, because again, women manufacture reproduction. Women are wonderful effect, sympathy towards women, blah, blah, blah. It's the standard model of agentic versus non-agentic. I hate that word, by the way, as many of you know, but it's useful for being descriptive here, right? So they're not going to put two and two together here. That's just not how it works. The problem with Inkwells and why Inkwells tend to rouse the ire and to trigger the absolute abysmal reactions that so many people have to them, more so than any other case I can think of, is because A, they're men, so automatic, less sympathy, and B, because it's overtly about reproduction. And the things they talk about are so overtly tied to reproduction that even the most normal of normies out there can make the link. This is not some vague genetic illness that might have downstream effects on your fitness later in life to anything. This is just men saying, look, I'm ugly, I'm this or that, I don't have a lot of money, whatever it might be. Usually it's the looks department. I can't get women, period. And so even the normies pick up on it, even the female comedians pick up on it, and so on and so forth. When things are overt, when they're overtly about reproduction, and here's the key thing. people become very, very picky and very harsh and critical. Because really what it is here is when you bring up reproduction and sexual selection, things very frequently automatically become self-referential. And so you're not just pitting yourself against one individual or a few, you're pitting yourself against the world when you express certain thoughts and give thoughts shape and form and tell people, look, I'm an inkwell because I'm a sub 5 or whatever. Everyone feels like they have an incentive because they're reflecting upon themselves to pitch in and give their 2 cents. Because perhaps in no other human domain, people are incredibly harsh, critical, brutal, and cruel when it comes to sexual selection. Above all, women. Men can be too, but men usually don't have the pick unless they're Chad Thunderschlong, obviously. In the case of women, we all know this. They're incredibly picky to begin with because they can get pregnant, blah. We all know the reasons, evolutionarily speaking. I'm going to repeat them. But when you talk about reproduction, especially in the context of women, and you are a subpar male in their view, they feel personally affronted because the mere suggestion to them that somehow your genes might coagulate with theirs and might lead to some outcome of offspring, i.e. fitness, is repugnant to them and terrifying because probably no woman on earth wants to pair up, copulate, and mix genes with an inkwell who has so many manifestly negative traits. And this is the actual source of this incredibly potent and visceral reaction in the most negative extreme way possible. And that's what we're seeing here. It's because reproduction, when it's overt, when you talk about it overtly, people get very antsy. They get very, very critical because they think it's about them, especially women. And this is why people are much more willing to accept friends, quote unquote, that are deficient in various ways that they would never accept as partners, above all women, right? Because with friends, at least in theory, there's no intention of crossing genes, which would then lead to reproductive results. So friends are okay, even if they're ugly or fat or what have you. And of course, there is an assortative mechanism going on there too. Let's not delude ourselves here. It's just that this mechanism is by no means as harsh or as brutal as the actual mate sorting mechanism. And here's where the rubber just meets the road at the end of the day. People, A, have very little sympathy for men in general. It's just what it is. Women have an in-group preference. Men don't have that. Sperm are expendable, therefore men are expendable. Top of that, you get the hyper-critical sexual selection criteria of women and the intuitive visceral reaction of the suggestion that males that are utterly repugnant to such women could possibly interact and in the worst case scenario, reproduce with them. Well, that is the worst thing in the world and it needs to be decried and rejected across the board and everyone needs to pitch in. Everything else is too vague. Cystic fibrosis, potential for cancer, heart condition, you name it, doesn't really matter. ADHD, it's all very vague, whatever, making poor life choices, becoming a drug addict. Sure, in the case of actually making sexual selection choices, a woman would discriminate based on something like that. Oh, he's a druggie, he's an alcoholic, I don't want that. But in the broadest sense, they're not thinking drug addiction, poor choice when it comes to studying what you study at university, jobs, or what have you. Not thinking immediately, he's claiming he has dibs on my reproductive rights. He's claiming he can actually reproduce with me. That's the distinction at the end of the day, and why this rhetoric is incredibly common, and why there will never be a shred of sympathy in even understanding towards inkwells, never mind the fact that this isn't really about natural selection anymore. It's almost, not entirely, but almost purely about sexual selection. But anyway, that's what's going on with this gentleman. And as always, thank you for tuning in. And many special thanks to my very generous patrons on Patreon, and my generous donors on PayPal. You guys are the best. Without you, this channel absolutely could not exist. Thank you so much. And if you can engage in the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, sharing the video, leaving a comment, subbing if you're not yet a sub, be much appreciated. I'm still alive. I'll check you out then. Until the next time, may the gods truly bless you and be with you. Until then, goodbye for now.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.